I was just passing by. That's what I kept telling myself, though my boots hesitated on the cracked tile of the little bookstore tucked between the hardware store and the cafe. I'd been in a rush, 15 minutes to kill, and yet something, maybe the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, maybe the faint smell of old paper, made me stop. She was behind the counter, sorting through a pile of returned novels, sleeves rolled up, wrists bare. Her hair was streaked with gray, but in a way that didn't age her. It made her look like she'd already lived a dozen interesting lives. She glanced up, caught me staring, though I didn't think I was staring, and smiled. Just a little, the corner of her mouth lifting, and I felt my chest tighten for no reason. Looking for anything? Her voice was warm, practiced, but with a subtle softness, like she was testing whether I'd stay or just vanish. Just passing by, I said, the words too quick, too hollow. She raised an eyebrow, one that seemed to carry both amusement and curiosity. Passing by, huh? She leaned on the counter, resting her chin lightly on her hand, and there was a pause, just long enough for me to feel ridiculous for saying it. My eyes flicked to a stack of worn paperbacks. My fingers brushed the edge of one, and she noticed, tilting her head as if she could read the story in my hesitation. The quiet between us stretched. It wasn't uncomfortable. Not exactly. It felt charged, like the pause before a train moves after a long wait. My throat tightened, and I couldn't tell if it was nerves or the way her presence filled the small space around me. Then, out of nowhere, she reached into a bag behind the counter and pulled out a cup of tea. Here, she said. It's chamomile. Helps with rushing through the day. I laughed, surprised, because I wasn't used to anyone noticing that about me. I don't think I'd realized I was holding my breath until she set it on the counter in front of me. Our fingers brushed, lightly, almost nothing, but it lingered longer than it should have. I cleared my throat and tried to step back, but my feet felt glued. You don't have to go, she said, almost casually, almost joking, and I caught it. The subtle invitation, the tiny flicker of expectation behind her eyes. It wasn't just kindness. It was something else. Something I wasn't supposed to name. I nodded, muttering something about just checking out the new arrivals, but my voice sounded small, uncertain. And while I wandered through the aisles, pretending to read, I found myself watching her over the tops of the books. She moved with quiet confidence, flipping pages, stacking returns with a kind of grace that made the space around her feel fuller, warmer. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. At one point, our eyes met again. She didn't look away. She never did, really. And when she spoke, her tone was softer, slower. Stay a little longer. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My chest was tight, my mind blank, and for the first time all day, I wasn't thinking about the rush or the errands I had to run. I was just thinking about her, the way her hand lingered on the counter, the way the sunlight hit her hair in that peculiar silver-gold mix, and the way that simple line, just a few words, had somehow stopped time. I left the bookstore 15 minutes later, tea untouched, heart beating a little faster, and I couldn't stop hearing her voice echoing in my head. Stay a little longer. I hadn't planned to go back. Not today, not so soon. But the bookstore hummed in my head all morning. The faint smell of paper, the quiet rhythm of her movements. So when my steps carried me to the corner of the street, I told myself it was only to return a book I hadn't really read. She was there, crouched behind the counter, untangling a mess of receipts. The sunlight slanted through the window, catching the silver in her hair and painting her in a soft, quiet glow. She didn't look up when I entered. I lingered by the shelves, pretending to browse, noticing the subtle lines around her eyes, the way her fingers worked over the paper with gentle precision. You're back, she said finally, voice calm, almost neutral. But there was a pause afterward, a quiet that held more than words. I nodded, smiling too quickly, my hands fidgeting against the book I held. I thought maybe you could help me with this, she said, holding up a stack of invoices. She didn't meet my eyes. Instead, she shuffled them as if I was just another pair of hands in the room. We worked in silence for a while, her movements precise, mine tentative. I watched her, noticing how her knuckles were slightly red from paper cuts, how her wrist flexed as she shifted the papers. She sighed softly, a sound barely audible, and I wondered how often she did that when no one was around. "You work too hard," I said, without thinking. The words were awkward, out of place. She glanced up at me then, eyes sharp but tired, like she had something she wanted to say but wasn't sure she could. "Maybe," she murmured, and her fingers brushed against mine as she passed me a sheet of paper. That fleeting touch made my chest tighten. There was a hesitation in her laugh when she finally spoke again, small, almost self-conscious. I caught it immediately, the kind of laugh that hides worry, fatigue, or something deeper you're not meant to see. We fell into a rhythm, she instructing, me following, quietly observing. There was a delicate tension in the air, unspoken but palpable. Every tilt of her head, every careful exhale, seemed loaded with meaning I wasn't allowed to name. At one point, she leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms over her head. Her shoulders tensed for a moment, then relaxed, and I realized how much I wanted to reach out, to touch that line of tension, to ease it somehow. But I didn't. I stayed silent, watching, aware that the very act of staying there, helping, was dangerous in its own way. Then, as she gathered the last of the invoices, our hands met briefly again, resting on the edge of the counter. Her gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary, and I caught the faintest tremble in her fingers. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough. Enough to make me think she felt the same pull I did, the quiet, forbidden energy that neither of us dared to name. She cleared her throat, shifting her eyes away, and said softly, "Thanks for helping." But the words hung in the air, stretched thin by everything left unsaid, by the almost electric tension vibrating in that small space. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and walked to the door. She didn't follow, but her eyes held me for a fraction longer, and in that instant, I felt it, every glance, every touch, every careful smile drawing me closer to something I shouldn't yet allow myself to want. And as I stepped back into the sunlight, I could still feel the warmth of her hand and the quiet pull of that energy between us. The rain started softly at first, tapping against the bookstore windows, then grew into a steady rhythm that made the room feel smaller, cozier, almost intimate. I was there later than usual, helping her reorganize a shelf of rare editions, and the dim light cast shadows across her face that made her look both approachable and untouchable at once. She moved carefully, adjusting a row of books, and I crouched beside her, my shoulder brushing hers for just a second. Too brief to matter, and yet long enough for the warmth to linger in a way that made my stomach twist. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words lodged themselves in my throat. "You know," she said quietly, almost to herself, "these editions, some of them carry more stories than the words inside." She paused, glancing at me from under lowered lashes. There was a weight in her tone, a suggestion of something unsaid, a confession almost spilling. I swallowed, careful not to breathe too loudly. Yeah, I get that. Too vague, too careful." She looked at me for longer than necessary, the corners of her mouth twitching in a ghost of a smile, like she knew I was floundering. We continued working in silence. Each movement was synchronized by habit, but electric with tension. My hand brushed hers again as we reached for the same ledger, and I froze. She didn't pull away. Instead, she lingered, fingertips barely grazing mine, and I could hear the faint rustle of the rain outside, an accidental drumbeat to the quiet storm building between us. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her shoulders stiffened. "I have to take this," she murmured, stepping back. I didn't move, though I wanted to ask if I should leave, if I should stay. But something in her posture, tension, hesitation, maybe guilt, kept me rooted. A man's voice came through the speaker, quick, clipped. I caught a fragment. "Weren't you supposed to meet me tonight?" Her jaw tightened. I can't. Not tonight." She ended the call abruptly, setting the phone down, and let out a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh. Her vulnerability hung in the air, like a door left ajar. I wanted to say something, comfort her, assure her, but the line between concern and intrusion felt impossibly thin. So I stayed silent, crouched beside her, noticing everything I hadn't before. The slight curve of her neck, the way her hands trembled for the briefest moment, the faint scent of her perfume that seemed to float even when she moved. We returned to our task, but proximity was no longer just accidental. My knee brushed hers under the counter. My hand hovered near hers as I passed her a book. Every time our fingers nearly touched, my heart hammered. I could sense her awareness of it, though she didn't react. At one point, she paused, looked up at me, eyes searching mine with an intensity one wasn't ready to name. For a split second, it felt as if the world narrowed to this small space, the rain outside, and that single heartbeat between us. My lips parted, words, a confession, a question, all caught in the same instant. Then she stepped back. "I think we should call it a night," she said softly, voice almost neutral but edged with something unspoken. I nodded, my chest tight, aware of every inch I had leaned closer, every thought I'd swallowed. And as she turned to close the shop, the briefest hesitation in her step, the flicker in her gaze, and the warmth of her proximity stayed with me. I left, drenched, the rain washing over me. But inside, the memory of that near touch, that almost confession, was impossible to shake. The bookstore was quiet that evening, quieter than usual. The rain had stopped, leaving a damp, metallic smell lingering outside. I found her sitting behind the counter, head resting on her hands, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. I hesitated in the doorway, feeling the weight of the hours, the unspoken words between us. "I didn't expect you back," she said finally, her voice low, measured. Not accusing, not welcoming, just present. I stepped closer, careful to keep the distance small but polite. "I wanted to check on the new arrivals," I murmured, and immediately knew how hollow it sounded. She didn't respond at first. Her eyes lifted slowly, and when they met mine, they were full of something I couldn't name. Curiosity, frustration, maybe a trace of regret. The silence stretched, each second louder than any words could be. Then she leaned forward slightly. "Do you ever wonder why we keep doing this?" Her hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white, and I realized she meant more than the bookstore, more than the small tasks. She meant us. I froze, wondered if I should speak, if speaking would ruin whatever fragile balance we had. But I couldn't look away. "Doing what?" I asked, even though I already knew she wasn't asking about the books. "This," she said, voice breaking just slightly. "Showing up, lingering, pretending it's normal. Pretending it's nothing." She paused, swallowing hard, eyes glimmering with a mix of anger and exhaustion. "What are we doing, really?" The question hit me harder than I expected. Not because I didn't know, I knew, but because I had been denying it. Pretending that the brush of her hand, the way her gaze followed me, the tension in the air, were all accidental. I took a step closer, careful, measuring, but still hesitant. I don't know," I admitted. My voice was small, uncertain, but honest in a way it had never been. I think I'm just drawn here. Drawn to you." Her lips pressed together, and for a moment, the room seemed suspended in fragile equilibrium. She looked down, then back up, meeting my gaze with the barest tremor in her eyelids. "And if we're drawn, what does that mean? For me? For you? For everything else?" I wanted to answer. I wanted to reassure her, to make sense of the heat in my chest, the tension that wrapped around us like smoke. But no words came. Instead, I just watched her, noticing the way her hair fell across her face, the faint shadow under her eyes, the tiny flicker of vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. We stayed there, neither of us moving, the silence thick and heavy. Every heartbeat felt louder than the last, every breath deliberate. And then, finally, she whispered, not to me, not for me, but into the air between us. "I can't keep pretending I don't notice." The weight of that line lingered long after. It wasn't confession. It wasn't clarity. It was something far worse, raw honesty, dangerous in its ambiguity and devastating in its quiet intensity. I stood frozen, knowing that nothing would ever feel the same again. I found her in the back of the bookstore, crouched near a stack of old letters she'd pulled from a forgotten box. The late afternoon sun fell in muted streaks through the dusty windows, catching on the silver in her hair. She looked fragile, but not in the way I'd ever seen before. Fragile in a way that made me want to step closer and offer something I couldn't name. "Do you ever regret things?" she asked suddenly, her voice low, almost a murmur. I froze mid-step, unsure whether she was talking to me or to herself. "Regret," I echoed cautiously. She nodded, eyes on the letters, her fingers brushing the edges as though they might cut her. "I mean, choices, people we let slip away. Sometimes I think about someone I should have held on to." Her lips trembled, and for a moment she looked younger, not the composed, confident woman I'd known. Vulnerable. Real. I swallowed hard. "I think about people like that, too," I admitted softly, voice barely above the whisper of pages turning. "People who mattered. Who still do." She glanced up at me then, a flicker of recognition in her eyes, and I caught the faintest hitch in her breath. "You don't know this person," she said, hesitant, shaking her head. "It was years ago, but," she trailed off, voice breaking slightly, and the pause hung heavy in the room. Something inside me tightened. "Without thinking," I said, "I do know loss." And then, against my own sense of caution, I added, "Someone I cared about, gone before I could even say what I needed." I see her sometimes in strangers, in small things. She stared at me, blinking rapidly, and I realized she was hearing a reflection of herself in my words. Her hands clutched the letters tighter, and I noticed how worn they were, edges curled, ink faded, small evidence of long-kept memories. "I lost someone too," she whispered, almost too quickly, as if speaking it aloud might make it real. "It was sudden, and I think, maybe, I've been trying to fill the emptiness ever since. With books, with routines, with nothing." Her voice wavered, and for the first time, the distance between us collapsed into something raw and human. I didn't know what to say. There was no advice, no solution, no neat words to untangle the ache in her chest. So I stayed close, careful to respect her space, noticing the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders, the tremor in her fingers, the way her gaze lingered on me, searching for something she couldn't name. Then, almost accidentally, her hand brushed mine as she passed me a letter. Neither of us pulled away. It was a fleeting contact, but it carried years of grief, memory, and quiet yearning, all compressed into a heartbeat. She looked at me, voice trembling now, almost a whisper. I didn't think anyone would ever notice. And in that moment, I realized she had been carrying it alone for years, and I had stumbled into the shadow of it, without asking, without intention, just by being here. The room seemed to hold its breath, the letters between us silent witnesses, and I felt the ground shift beneath everything I thought I knew. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, eyes glimmering. And in the soft, trembling way she looked at me, I knew nothing could ever be quite the same. The rain had returned, soft and steady, drumming a gentle rhythm on the windows. We sat together at the counter, a stack of returned books between us that neither of us bothered to sort. Neither spoke at first. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with everything we hadn't said, with all the almost moments that had stretched between us over weeks. I watched her hands, the way they folded over the worn edges of a novel, fingers tracing the spine absent-mindedly. She glanced up, catching me looking, and for a heartbeat, her gaze softened. Not shy, not hesitant, just open, vulnerable in a way that felt like permission. "I'm tired," she said quietly, not complaining, just stating it like a fact. "Tired of pretending. Tired of," she trailed off, lips pressed together. I didn't need her to finish. I knew. I had felt it too, in the pauses, in the moments we couldn't speak. I reached out slowly, careful, and brushed my fingers against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand shifted slightly, letting mine rest there, small and deliberate. The warmth was immediate, grounding, like it had been waiting for this simple acknowledgement. For the first time, the distance between us felt unnecessary. The careful restraint, the hesitation, the questions without answers, they all melted into something quiet but undeniable. We didn't speak, because words felt too loud, too clumsy for what was happening. Instead, we shared space, a mutual understanding that had grown too strong to ignore. She leaned back just enough for our shoulders to touch, subtle, but enough to make the air between us electric. I felt her exhale, slow and steady, as if she had been holding her breath for years and finally decided it was safe to let it out. "I don't know what comes next," she said after a long pause, voice low but steady. "I don't have answers." "Neither do I admitted, and somehow that made it easier. Easier to accept that we didn't need a plan, a declaration, or a promise. It was enough to just be here. Together. Present. Another pause. My thumb brushed against the back of her hand. She tilted her fingers slightly, letting me hold it for a little longer. Small, simple, but it carried every unspoken confession, every glance, every missed step along the way. The storm outside softened to a drizzle, light spilling over the pages, over our hands, over the quiet space we'd created together. I didn't have to ask if she felt it too. She did, and that was enough. No dramatic words, no sudden confessions. Just this, shared space, warmth, and the inevitability of connection earned through weeks of hesitation, silence, and subtle truths. And in that quiet, mundane perfection, I realized we had crossed the point of return. Not with a flourish, not with fireworks, but with the simple act of letting each other in. Her head leaned ever so slightly toward mine. Not fully, not in a gesture of surrender, but enough to make the world outside irrelevant. My fingers tightened on hers, and for the first time, everything felt right. We didn't need more. We just stayed there, together, while the rain whispered against the glass. It's strange, looking back now. Months have passed since that quiet evening in the bookstore, since the rain drummed against the windows, and we let the world slip away without noticing. And yet, in some ways, it feels like it just happened yesterday. The way her fingers fit against mine, the soft tilt of her head, the silence that said more than any words ever could. I think about her often, not in the obsessive, unmoored way I used to. Those early days when a glance or a smile could unravel me, but with something steadier, warmer. She taught me that closeness doesn't have to be loud. That connection isn't about confessions or declarations. Sometimes it's in shared space, in the patience to wait, in the courage to notice someone else's quiet. And she changed too, I think. I can see it when I remember her handling the letters she once hid, her laughter more unguarded, her eyes lighter. She let herself feel again, let someone in without losing herself in the process. The weight she carried for years didn't disappear, but she learned to carry it with someone beside her. I watched her bloom quietly, in small gestures, in moments I might have missed if I hadn't been paying attention. I learned something too, about love, about patience, about the strange, messy way life nudges you toward the people you're meant to notice. It's not always about fireworks or perfect timing. Sometimes it's about being present, about listening to silences, about choosing to stay a little longer. That's how love becomes something you live, rather than something you chase. I still remember the first night we crossed that line. The subtle brush of hands, the quiet acknowledgement of something inevitable. I replay it in my mind sometimes, not as a fantasy, but as a lesson, that love can be patient, messy, human, that it can grow in pauses, in awkward smiles, in moments we almost don't recognize until they've already shaped us. And now, sitting in my own apartment, a cup of tea in hand, I smile softly to myself. The memory is tender, comforting. I realized that the story wasn't about the sparks or the longing. It was about learning to see, truly see, someone else. About letting them see you. And somehow, in that gentle exchange, everything else fell into place. Life hasn't stopped being complicated. She still has her routines, I still have my own. But the space between us isn't filled with uncertainty anymore. It's filled with understanding, quiet trust, and a slow-burning warmth that neither of us could have forced. It's not perfect. It's real. And it's enough. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?